Right. It is 11 o'clock, so I think we will get going. I can see a few more people joining us. Welcome, welcome. I hope you can all hear me clearly. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's part 2 of the flood mini-series that we are doing in conjunction with Conveyancing Data Services. Thanks for coming back and joining me today. Hope everybody is well. As always, bit of housekeeping before I get going. We will be recording today's session. We've got a copy of the slides as well. So if you would like either of those after the webinar, please do reach out to us and we will get those over to you shortly. You should see a control panel on the screen, which allows you to ask written questions. Please feel free to submit them as we go, and I'll try and get them answered either during or after the webinar. I am working from home today. There was a pair of gentlemen with a jackhammer outside of my office window. Thankfully, they've moved on. I'm really hoping they don't come back. So apologies if there's any loud noises, but hopefully they will not return in the next 20-25 minutes. Just to recap, so in part 1, we reviewed the very basics of flood risk. We looked at the different types of flood risks that could happen to different properties. We looked at examples of each of those types and how again, they impact properties in different ways. In today's mini webinar, we're going to look at the reasons why a flood search is quite important, particularly when it comes to property transactions. So let me get going. So, is a flood search necessary? We certainly think so. And we will talk about each point that's on the screen as we go along, but certainly these are kind of the main points and the main reasons why we think they're really, really important. To be fair, it's probably taking over importance in terms of environmental issues, as opposed to historically, contaminated land was kind of the big thing that we got asked about a lot. Now I think it's safe to say flooding is probably a very close second, if not getting to one of the top reasons why we get asked a lot of questions when it comes to environmental reports. So, flooding. There's a lot of common misconceptions with flooding. A lot of them tend to be, well, I live up on a hill, I'm never going to have any flood risk to my property. I don't live near a water course is one that we hear a lot as well. Therefore, I'm not at risk of flooding. So these are all false. Flooding can occur anywhere and it can impact all types of properties. As we saw in part 1 of this webinar series, flooding can occur from a variety of different sources, and you don't have to live near water courses to be impacted by flooding. Surface water is of course caused by rainfall, and groundwater is of course water that rises above the ground from the aquifers that sit underneath us. You can of course be impacted if you live on top of a hill. That tends to be things like surface water runoff. I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say things like, well, I've lived here for 20 years and it's never flooded. Just because an area is never flooded, that doesn't mean it won't in the future. And to give you specific examples, when Cockermouth flooded in 2005 and 2009, the previous flood event was in 1966. Floods devastated Henley-on-Thames in 2014, and the previous flood event prior to that was 1947. Particularly when it comes to flood, risk doesn't tend to decrease over time. Whilst local knowledge is very useful, it isn't able to necessarily predict what might happen in the future. Other things like living in the top floor of a building or higher floors of a building, you might think you're pretty safe. And whilst your personal possessions, your client's personal possessions may not necessarily get damaged, your property, will remain dry if you're in higher levels. Access will be affected. And when we do talk about flooding, particularly when we're looking at whole blocks of flats, we are talking about a whole building. So whilst a higher floor may be safe, access to the property could become restricted or even completely cut off. Things like cars and private underground basements may also become flooded, and that has happened in the past as well. So flooding doesn't necessarily just have to mean inundation of water to a property. It can also mean restricting access and impacting the services and access like staircases and elevators, etc. So regardless of where you live or what you think you might know about the area, there is a real clear need to investigate flood risk in every transaction. So a property may not necessarily be at risk today or have ever flooded, but the effects of climate change really are becoming more apparent, and it's increasing the intensity and frequency of bad and extreme weather that we have. So we want to make sure that your client's assets are protected throughout the lifetime of their property. And so therefore, it's fairly imperative to investigate flood risk, regardless of property type, locality, or local knowledge. Now, in terms of property damage, not only does flooding inundate a property with water, it can affect the structural integrity, it can cause contamination and impact insurance premiums and mortgageability. We are unique in our position that if insurance isn't available for a property, the property is effectively unmortgageable in this country. Flood not only damages what's in the property, like the carpets or the electrics or personal possessions, but it can impact structural integrity of a property as well. Flood water, of course, isn't always clean, perhaps with the exception of groundwater, but this only applies if let's say groundwater is the only type of flooding to occur to a property, which in most extreme scenarios that we've seen in the media, it's actually different. It's layers of different kinds, and I mentioned that in the previous presentation as well. A flood event can therefore also cause contamination, and this is usually as a result of things like overflowing sewers and less than clean rivers, but also it can cause contamination from a contaminated land perspective. So there are many industries and landfills along riverbanks, and if these rivers burst their banks and flood these areas, landfills, industries, pollution and contamination can also be transported by floodwater into people's homes and buildings. The value of the property is likely to also be reduced if it does experience flood risk. RICS have stated that the value of property at risk from flooding is less than that of a similar property that isn't at risk. So flood risk will affect the value for two reasons. One is, first, is the impact of a flood on the continued use of the premises, the health and safety of its occupants, and any consequential damage and disruption. And two is obtaining buildings insurance cover for the property. If it's difficult to arrange cover, it will affect the ability to arrange a mortgage for the property, as buildings insurance is so important in determining whether a property is mortgageable, and therefore the market value of the property. Owners and prospective buyers are advised to verify their cover, or verify this type of cover is provided and maintained by determining the property's flood risk. The reduction in value may range from negligible to severe, depending on the particular circumstances of the property's location, situation, type of construction, and flood defenses, both to the geographic area and to the property in particular. And the impact on value can be reduced by ensuring better flood defenses are in place, or flood resilience and resistance measures are in place to the property. Now, insurers and lenders are also increasingly looking at property level protection, and in some areas, property level protection may become mandatory to ensure a property can actually be insured. And I'll talk a little bit about flood resistance and resilience measures later on in the presentation. Now, this is just it's an oldie but goodie. So for those of you that don't know the phrase caveat emptor, this of course essentially means buyer beware in Latin. So it is the principle that the buyer alone is responsible for checking the quality and suitability of goods before a purchase is made. And it strongly applies, of course, to the purchase of property and land in this country. Now, this is an oldie but goodie case. But it is still very much relevant. So this particular property is a large 5-bedroom house, which boasted a beautiful sprawling garden. In 2014, the property was sold for £750,000 to another couple who in the following winter woke up and found their garden was underwater, which is what you can see in the photo. A few weeks later, the same thing happened again. And then on the third occasion it flooded, their basement flooded as well. However, when the property was purchased, the previous owners had completed their property information form and ticked no to the flooding question. It then transpired that the same thing had actually happened previously, back in 2012, and the owners at the time had posted a few photos of the actual flood happening on their social media channels, which did not help them with the pursuing legal claim against them. So yeah, that wasn't great. It should be noted that we didn't actually supply a report on this property. We did have a look when we saw it in the news. There was another case following a 6-year legal battle. Former owners who effectively lied to their buyers that the garden drive or property never flooded were ordered to pay £150,000 after the court ruled they shouldn't have told their buyers that when they bought the house back in 2007 that the garden had flooded in the past. So the purchasers were assured by the vendors that this home that they were buying with a stream running through the garden had never flooded, and this was in a town in Wiltshire. But the River Marden had burst its banks and left the house surrounded and the garden in waist-deep floodwater. Now, the purchasers had asked the sellers about flooding because in a nearby town in Tetbury, they had suffered previously in the floods back in 2007, and the seller said he believed the whole area had not experienced flooding in over 100 years. And the seller confirmed in writing that the house, garden, and garage and drive had never flooded. Now, the neighbors had told the purchaser that they'd seen them cleaning out the garage after it had flooded previously, and they had also replaced the lawn. So, of course, the sellers lost the case and they were made to pay that money. But again, it's just really important to kind of make sure that, the client is fully aware of the potential of flood risk to the property. And by doing these types of searches, you help them cover that risk. Now, climate change plays a huge part in the things we've experienced in the last few years. Climate change means we can expect to face more frequent or severe weather events like flooding, droughts, and storms. These events bring physical risk that impact our society directly and have the potential to affect the economy. If these events happen more frequently, which they seem to be, people will become more reliant on insurance to cover the cost of damage to their houses and cars. As weather-related insurance claims rise, insurance companies have more to pay out, increasing everyone's premiums. If companies and households are not insured, they may need to foot the bill themselves, and in both cases, the consumer ends up paying more. Weather-related losses, both insured and uninsured, are much higher and have become much higher in recent decades. A white paper produced by our flood data supplier Ambiental has identified that risks are starting to become perceived as being less insurable, and alternative market structures are being evaluated which provide better incentives for homeowners to install flood resistance measures. So things like door guards or concrete floors, etc., etc. In terms of insurance, a publication by Hudson et al. In 2019 showed that the average risk-based flood insurance premium in Europe could double between 2015 and 2055 in the case that households do not take steps to reduce potential damages from flooding. Currently, both in the UK and continental Europe, flood insurance mechanisms do not currently incentivize risk reduction by policyholders, and as such, vulnerability to climate-induced flooding risk is, of course, increasing. Now, in terms of mortgage lending and banking, there is a growing awareness within the sector, as well as an increasing regulatory pressure to manage and mitigate climate risk from future flood damage and across mortgage portfolios. Given a typical mortgage term of 25 years, and notwithstanding the fact that many borrowers will remortgage several times within the term, the increasing flood risk in the UK means that the value of mortgaged assets could be reduced significantly going forward. And based on property level climate risk modeling carried out by Ambiental, it has been estimated that an additional 1.2 million properties across the country could be at high risk of flooding by 2050. Given that the ONS suggests that around 35% of UK households have property debt, and the average value of a mortgage in the UK is roughly about £137,000. This means that around £60 billion in mortgage debt could be impaired by 2050 due to climate-induced flooding alone. So, things to think about. In terms of the cost of flooding, the flood damage currently costs the country around £1.3 billion a year. The total economic damage for England for the winter of 2015 to 2016 floods, as an example, was estimated to be around 1.6 billion, with 32% of total damages occurring to the business sector. Low-income households are amongst the most at risk to flooding and the detrimental financial consequences. They are 8 times more likely to live in tidal floodplains than affluent households, and 61% of low-income renters do not have home contents insurance, leaving them even more susceptible to experiencing a financial shock. Now, the economic loss and damage from flooding in the country is projected to increase. There is a 10% chance of a catastrophic flood happening in England within the next 2 decades, causing in excess of 10 billion in damage. Such a flood would cause 10 times more flood damage than the combined impact of the tidal surge storms in the winter of 2013 and 2014, and 3 to 4 times more damage than the floods we experienced in 2007. So again, something really to think about when we're looking at cost. Now, there are slight nuances between the wording used in the conveyancing handbook and the practice note. However, both advise similar further investigation options. Whilst there are various ways to investigate flood risk, including using government services such as the Environment Agency website or the HML Land Registry flood indicator, the most effective way of identifying whether a property is at risk is by conducting a search through a provider such as ourselves or whoever you want to use. Now, we've already covered why making inquiries of the seller isn't always a guaranteed way of accessing accurate information. Let the professionals do this for you through either a standalone flood search or a combined Enviro search, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the guidance. I don't think I need to explain that a little bit more. In terms of part 3, next week, which is the last in this flood series, we're going to take a closer look at the flood risk assessments and actually how they work. So we'll look at the risk assessment approach, what flood risk probability actually means, and also flood resistance and resilience measures and what reporting options are available. And so that is it, quick and easy. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or requests, please do let us know. And as always, there is a feedback survey that's going to launch after this webinar, and we'd really love it if you could take a few seconds to give us some feedback. So have a great rest of the morning.